Through the quiet ages, a journey across human endurance. The night begins softly, without weight or demand. The air has settled into a slower rhythm, as though the world itself has decided to rest. You can feel it on your skin, the warmth leaving the day, the quiet sliding in to replace it. The clocks have stopped mattering. The tasks have stopped calling. Everything that once felt urgent has learned to wait. You are allowed to breathe again. The body understands rest even when the mind forgets. Let it lead. Let the breath draw deep and long, and the thoughts fade like distant waves. Outside, the world exhales in unison, the wind through trees, the hush of far-off streets, the soft hum that fills the spaces we never notice. You don't have to reach for anything. The quiet will come to you. The dark is not empty. It is full of everything that has ever lived and learned to sleep. The past drifts through it, gentle and unthreatening, turning all that was once noise into rhythm. The night is vast, but it holds you easily. There is no need to think of tomorrow or of what went wrong today. You are already forgiven by time itself. The world has been here before. Endless cycles of effort and surrender, light and rest, sound and silence. Every life that came before has left a trace in this calm, and you are breathing it now. History, when quiet, is simply the memory of endurance. Every sigh, every pause, every moment of stillness has belonged to someone. Tonight, it belongs to you. You don't have to fix, to prove, to chase. You are not running anymore. You are drifting, safe inside the long exhale of the earth. Breathe with it. Let go. What you feel now is not emptiness. It is peace wearing the face of silence. The night does not rush, it only waits. Now, as the stillness deepens, the journey begins. We move first into violence and survival, where the air was thick with iron, sweat, and smoke. This was a world where men fought not for glory, but to stay alive. The clang of metal was the heartbeat of existence, and courage was simply the refusal to fall. There were no heroes, only survivors. When the battle ended, silence returned as mercy. Then the forge cools and the sound of war fades into labor and life. The earth replaces the sword. The hands that once struck in fear now plant in faith. Gardens rise where blood once fell. The soil becomes a quiet companion, teaching patience, generosity, and rhythm. In the turning of seasons, people found peace more lasting than victory. But the flame of the spirit never goes out. It returns as yearning and freedom, echoing in chains and footsteps. Spartacus stands beneath an open sky, his voice a whisper that shakes empires. His rebellion is brief, but its echo eternal, a reminder that even bound bodies hold unbroken souls. The fire he lit has never gone dark. It burns still somewhere behind every act of courage. And finally, the fire softens into light. We arrive at thought and meaning, in rooms of marble and candlelight, where voices murmur softly over cups of wine. The Greek Symposium, a place where battle gave way to reflection, where conquest turned into curiosity. Here, philosophy was born not in temples, but in conversation, in the gentle exchange between wonder and understanding. In those moments, humanity learned to listen to itself. From iron to soil, from chains to thought, the story of humankind unfolds like the night. Loud at first, then tender, then still. What remains after all the noise is not power, but peace. The hammer rests, the soil breathes, the rebellion fades, the candles burn low. And what is left is silence, the kind that doesn't demand sleep, but offers it freely. Tonight, that silence is yours. Iron prison, the weight of armor. The world of the night was not golden light and gallant honor. It was heavy, slow, and unbearably human. The armor he wore was not freedom, but a cage. Each piece of metal locked him deeper into silence. The breastplate clung like a second skin, hard and unyielding. Beneath it, heat gathered and refused to leave. The air turned thick, the sound of breath echoing inside the helmet like waves trapped in a shell. Sweat dripped down his neck, gathering at the seams. Every movement became a negotiation between pain and pride. The armor weighed more than 50 kilograms, and it pressed on the shoulders until they forgot how to be light. Under the sun, it became an oven of iron, baking the body slowly, turning the man inside into steam. When he fell, he did not fall gracefully. He fell like a statue, too heavy to rise, too proud to admit defeat. The mud held him, the weight held him, and the silence mocked him. Still he moved forward one step, then another. The clatter of plates and the dull thud of boots formed a strange kind of rhythm, a heartbeat of iron. From afar, it looked noble. Up close, it was exhausting. Inside that shining shell was not a hero, but a human being gasping for air. At night, when the armor was finally removed, the knight's skin bore its memory. Red lines across the chest, bruises on the shoulders, the faint scent of metal still clinging to him. Freedom was not victory. It was simply the feeling of air touching the skin again. The armor was meant to protect him, but it also reminded him of fragility. Every clang of steel was a whisper of mortality. Beneath the iron and discipline, there was always a quiet wish to feel light again, to move without restraint, to stand in the wind as himself. History remembers the knight for courage, but perhaps the truest bravery was in enduring the weight of his own protection. The armor shone in sunlight, but inside it, a man was learning the hardest lesson of all, that safety can also be a prison, and that sometimes survival itself is an act of patience. Rain of arrows. The sky of iron. The field was quiet before it began. A light wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of damp earth and smoke. Soldiers stood waiting, their breath slow, their eyes fixed on a horizon they could not yet see. The world held still for a moment, as if taking a single long breath before the sky broke open. Then came the sound, a whisper at first, thin and sharp, a sound too soft to fear. It grew quickly, swelling into a hiss that filled the air. The arrows came not as lines but as waves, endless and unseen. They fell in thousands, slicing through the light, turning the day to dusk. There was no warning, no time to raise a shield or find courage. The world became motion and sound. The men on the front line did not shout, they only closed their eyes and waited. The air itself seemed alive, vibrating with the sound of feathers and wind. Arrows struck armor, soil, flesh, and the dull rhythm became something ancient, something almost rhythmic, like rain against stone. To stand there was to understand how small a person could feel beneath the sky. The noise around you disappeared into a kind of stillness, a numb calm that comes when fear has nowhere left to go. The battle was not seen, it was heard, felt, breathed. The English longbowman, calm and patient, drew and released in one endless motion. Each arrow carried not hatred, but routine. Each flight was the same gesture repeated by hundreds of hands, a strange, mechanical grace. Above, the sky darkened with the weight of metal. The sun slipped behind a veil of arrows. For a heartbeat, the world was shadow, and yet there was beauty in it, the symmetry, the unity, the silence that followed each release. The ground shimmered with points of steel, like rain that had forgotten how to end. The field, once green, became a mirror of the sky, every blade of grass bent beneath the memory of flight. When it was over, the wind returned, the clouds moved again, the field exhaled. Men stood blinking in the strange light, as if the day itself had been changed. The rain of arrows had passed, leaving behind the calm that always follows chaos. The reminder that even in war, the world still finds its way back to silence. Warhorse, the true force of battle. The sound came before the sight. A low thunder rolled across the field, distant at first, then closer, heavier, until it filled the chest like a heartbeat made of earth. The warhorses were coming. They were not elegant or graceful. They were storms in motion, half a ton of muscle and instinct, trained to run through fear itself. The ground trembled as hundreds charged, iron shoes striking the soil in perfect rhythm. It was no longer a battle, but a natural event, a collision of man, beast, and gravity. Each horse was a weapon long before the knight ever lifted his spear. Their eyes burned with focus, their breath white in the cold air. They had been taught not to turn away from danger, but to dive into it. To stand before them was to face something larger than courage or skill. It was to face momentum. The sound of their gallop grew into a single, endless note, and the air itself seemed to break apart. When the wave hit, it was not rage that killed, it was weight. The first line disappeared, swallowed by hooves and armor. Shields bent, bodies fell, and the battlefield became a sea of mud, sweat, and panic. The lucky ones fell quickly, the rest were crushed into the earth, their names lost beneath the thunder. There were no heroes in that moment, no duels of glory, only the raw physics of power meeting flesh. And yet, even in this chaos, there was a strange rhythm, a terrible grace. The horses moved as one body, trained through years of repetition and patience. Every charge was a dance learned by heart, every motion guided by trust between rider and mount. Beneath the roar and dust, there was understanding. The knight trusted the animal completely, and the animal obeyed without hesitation. When the battle ended, silence returned like a sigh. The ground was scarred, the air heavy with steam and soil. The horses stood still, their flanks trembling, their eyes calm again. They had done what they were made to do, and now, like all living things, they sought quiet. In that stillness lay the truth of war, not triumph or pride, but exhaustion. The kind that comes when nature itself has finished its work, and all that remains is dust, breath, and the slow return of peace. Companions of chaos. When allies became the storm. In the crowded press of bodies, danger often arrives from the side you least expect. In lines meant to be steady, a single moment of fear bends motion into harm. Your neighbor's spear may be aimed at the enemy, but a stumble, a step, a misplaced thrust can make a friend the cause of your fall. There is no malice in that instant, only the blunt logic of weight and momentum. You stand close to people who share your breath, and that very closeness can turn into peril when the world narrows. When sight narrows and sound sharpens, the body moves before the mind speaks. Feet falter, shields collide, and a forward push becomes a fatal shove. Orders drown in noise. Movement becomes a chain reaction of unintended harm. After the surge, the field holds a stunned hush and the hard truth that the threat sometimes came from within. Archers and lancers are precise in calm, but in chaos their tools fly without asking. An arrow aimed at a distant mass may pass through the wrong line. A charging horse follows momentum, not banners. Disaster is often the simple meeting of unpredictable motion and fragile bodies. In the wrecked quiet, men look for blame and sometimes find only the common names of neighbors, not anonymous foes. There is a gentle lesson in remembering this. History tells of friendly wounds not to shame, but to soften our view of the past. Those who hurt by accident are often those who later bind and carry the wounded. After battle, the hands that thrust become the hands that lift. In the cool calm that follows, care arrives from the same close company that once risked harm. Close proximity can be danger and refuge alike. The shape depends on patience and attention. So listen to these stories gently. They are small warnings and quiet guides toward kind emotion among people who must move together. In the end, the memory of these mistakes asks for compassion rather than judgment. It reminds us that close company requires rules and rhythm, soft signals and patient steps. Communities that march together thrive when they learn rituals to keep space and watch each other's pace. That attention keeps nearest person from becoming nearest harm. It is a quiet practice, like learning to breathe together on a night march together.
Mud, the silent enemy.
After hours of battle, the ground began to change. What had started as solid earth turned into a slow, thick sea of mud. Every step sank deeper, every breath grew heavier. The rain had done what no army could. It took the strength from men, the rhythm from their movement, and the balance from the world itself. The field became alive, soft and shifting, swallowing everything without anger, without mercy. The knights, once radiant in shining armor, found themselves trapped by the very steel that was meant to protect them. Each step pulled harder than the last. The weight of iron, 50 or 60 kilograms of it, pressed downward until the ground accepted them completely. The mud clung to their boots, their legs, their knees, and finally, their pride. Some tried to move forward, others simply stood, breathing through the narrow slits of their helmets, their lungs filled with steam and despair. The sky, grey and endless, offered no help, only more rain, more surrender. At Agincourt, the battlefield was not conquered by archers or blades, but by the slow patience of water and soil. The rain fell in quiet rhythm, soft as breath, steady as fate. Horses slipped and crashed into the mire, men who had trained for years, men who had believed themselves indestructible, were pulled under by the weight of their own glory. They didn't die from arrows, but from gravity, from the earth reminding them of what they were. And yet, in the stillness after, when the rain slowed and the air cooled, there was something almost peaceful about it. The field, covered in mist, seemed to breathe again. The same mud that took lives now rested quietly, blanketing the noise, softening the world. Nature had reclaimed what was hers, not through fury, but through calm inevitability. The story of mud is not one of cruelty, but of balance. It reminds us that even the strongest fall to softness, that even war is silenced by the weight of earth and rain. Long after the swords have rusted and the banners have faded, the soil remains, quiet, patient, eternal. In the end, the ground holds everything, and in its still embrace, the world finally sleeps. Panic, the quiet plague of battle. It began in silence, as most disasters do. A single man stumbled, then turned, his eyes wide with something larger than fear. He ran, and in that instant, the rhythm of the field changed. One heartbeat became many, one movement became a wave. The sound of footsteps replaced the clash of steel. It spread faster than fire, faster than thought. Within seconds, the air filled with the sound of panic, armor clattering, voices breaking, the thud of boots striking mud. What was once an army became a storm of motion, a living tide of confusion. Fear has always been the truest contagion. It needs no words, no orders. It moves from breath to breath, from one heartbeat to the next, invisible and complete. The strongest men feel it first in their stomachs, then in their legs. The mind wants to stay, but the body knows only one command: run. When one soldier runs, another follows. When 10 flee, the rest begin to doubt the ground beneath them. And in that moment of doubt, the line dissolves. Commanders shout from horseback, raising banners, blowing horns that vanish into the noise. They call for courage, for order, for sense, but courage cannot compete with instinct. Flags fall from trembling hands. Horses rear in confusion. Wheels of wagons twist into the ground, trapping the fallen beneath them. The battlefield becomes a place without direction, where sound replaces reason and motion replaces will. Yet when the dust settles and the echo fades, what remains is not shame, but understanding. Panic, like rain or thunder, is part of the human storm. It is not weakness, but memory, an ancient echo reminding us how fragile control can be. History remembers these moments not to mock them, but to show that even the brave are still made of breath and fear. In the quiet after, when soldiers look at one another with wide, dazed eyes, a strange calm returns. They learn again how to stand, how to breathe, how to trust their own stillness. And in that stillness lies the truest kind of strength, the kind that waits, endures, and forgives the chaos that every heart must sometimes feel. Sound of the Inferno. The noise that consumed the world. There were no anthems, no rhythm, no music, only the raw sound of chaos, unshaped and endless. It began with the clang of metal, iron against iron, sharp enough to pierce thought itself. Then came the shouting, the breathless cries of men calling to names already lost to the wind. Horses screamed, arrows whistled, and somewhere in the distance, a horn broke mid-note. The air thickened with sound until it felt alive, a living storm that swallowed all sense and silence. To stand within it was to vanish into vibration. The mind could not think, the ear could not choose. The noise did not come from one place, it came from everywhere at once, echoing off armor, striking stone, bouncing through lungs and bones. Commands dissolved into the roar. Men turned their heads to listen and found only confusion. The ground itself seemed to hum with the rhythm of battle, a pulse that erased reason and replaced it with instinct. There was no space for thought, no moment for calm. The noise filled every gap where fear might rest, leaving only exhaustion. The body moved without guidance, following whatever shape the chaos carved. Each cry, each metallic scream folded into another until the field became one long, unbroken note, a sound that was neither life nor death, but something between. And yet, when the fighting faded, when breath returned, and the world began to cool, the silence that followed felt strange, almost fragile. The ringing in the ears became its own reminder, a faint echo of the storm that once ruled the air. It lingered long after the last sword fell, whispering in the stillness that every noise, no matter how violent, must eventually end. History remembers the clash, but not the quiet that came after, the trembling peace that crept back into the world when men stopped shouting. It is that silence, not the roar, that endures. The earth absorbs the sound, the sky forgives it, and what remains is calm, the kind that feels earned, ancient, and deeply human.
The true killer, disease, hunger, and the breath of the earth.
Long after the swords had gone quiet, the real battle began. It was not fought with noise or fury, but with air, with heat, with water. The fields that once echoed with war fell silent, and the silence itself became a slow and steady threat. Men who had survived arrows and blades now faced something far older, far calmer, and far more patient. The enemy was everywhere, carried in the air they breathed, the food they ate, the ground they slept on. There were no banners for this war, no trumpets, no mercy. Only the endless rhythm of bodies giving way to time. The heat came first. The armor that once felt like pride became a furnace. Beneath the iron, skin burned, sweat gathered in every fold, every seam, until it felt as though the body was drowning from within. The sun watched without care, turning soldiers into moving reflections of light. When they removed their helmets, steam lifted from their faces, the air shimmered, thick with dust and breath. Some fell from exhaustion, others simply sat down and could not rise again. Then came the cold. Night crept quietly through the camp, slipping between tents, coiling around bones. The same fields that baked men alive by day now froze them in stillness. Breath turned visible, hanging in the air like ghosts refusing to leave. Firelight flickered across faces drawn and hollow. They huddled together beneath cloaks that smelled of smoke and metal, whispering not of enemies, but of warmth. In that quiet, death no longer came with sound, it came with sleep. Food was scarce, and what remained carried its own dangers. Bread baked weeks ago hardened into stone, meat spoiled faster than memory. The air smelled of salt and rot. They chewed because hunger left no choice, washing every bite down with water drawn from streams, shared with horses, with waste, with everything the world discarded. The taste lingered, metallic, bitter, ancient. Some joked through cracked lips that they were drinking the earth itself. Most said nothing at all. Disease followed soon after. It moved faster than any cavalry, invisible but relentless. One cough became many. A single fever spread through the camp like wind through leaves. Dysentery, typhoid, the plague, names that meant the same thing in the end. Men carried the sickness inside their armor, sweating through fevers that melted into chills. The healers did what they could: water, rest, herbs pressed into wounds. But the air itself seemed spoiled, the ground alive with infection. A small cut on the hand could bloom into death within days. The body, already exhausted by fear and marching, no longer fought back. They learned to measure life differently. Not in victories or kills, but in mournings survived. The sunrise was enough, a sign that the lungs still drew air, that the blood still obeyed its rhythm. They counted not the days, but the breaths between sickness. The camps grew quieter as the weeks passed. Men whispered prayers without words, eyes fixed on the horizon where nothing moved. The sound of flies replaced the sound of drums. And yet, in that stillness, something deeply human remained. They shared what warmth they had, passing scraps of bread, lifting the weak, steadying one another through mud and fever. In the face of decay, they found the smallest grace, companionship. A soldier who had once killed without thought now wiped the brow of a dying comrade, his touch gentle, his eyes distant. Survival had stripped away pride, leaving only care. The earth watched it all, unmoved but eternal. The same soil that swallowed bodies gave rise to grass again. The rivers that carried disease returned each spring, clear as glass, as though forgetting the misery they once held. Time kept moving, slow and kind. History, when it looks back, often remembers the battles, the noise, the banners, the heroes carved into stone. But the real story was written in silence, in fevered breaths, in the stillness between storms. Disease, hunger, and weather were not villains. They were reminders. They showed the limits of steel, of will, of glory. They whispered that the body, no matter how brave, is still part of the world it tries to conquer. The rain does not choose sides. The wind carries both the healthy and the dying in the same direction. When the war ended and the fields grew quiet once more, nature began its patient work of erasure. Grass covered graves, rain washed away the blood, and the earth exhaled again. What remained was not horror, but balance, the eternal conversation between life and decay. The men were gone, but their breath lingered in the wind, their dust became part of the ground, and their stories softened into the rhythm of the world. So when we remember them now, it is not as warriors, but as part of something older, the endless cycle of endurance. The heat, the cold, the hunger, the disease, all of it returning to the same truth, that everything, even suffering, must eventually rest. And in that rest, there is peace. The kind that does not ask to be earned, but simply arrives when the noise fades, when the body releases, and when the earth takes back what was always hers. The nameless dead, the quiet shadow of history. There are no songs for them, no names carved into marble, no banners carried in memory. Only the faint sound of time moving forward, soft and unbothered, carrying away the voices that once filled the air. The nameless dead rest beneath every field and every city, woven into the soil that remembers everything yet speaks of nothing. History moves gently over them, smoothing the noise, polishing the rough edges of their stories, until even memory becomes quiet. In the grand telling of the past, we speak of kings and crowns, of generals and victories, of wars that reshaped the world. But for every name remembered, there are thousands that were never spoken again. They stood in the same fields, breathed the same air, saw the same stars, but their stories vanished into the folds of time. They were the hands that built walls, carried banners, dug trenches, and died in places no map ever marked. They lived fully, and yet history made them ghosts. The irony of it is gentle, not cruel. They dreamed, like anyone, of being remembered. Perhaps they thought of their village, their mother's face, the warmth of bread, the laughter before dawn. They marched because someone asked them to, because someone promised meaning. And yet, when the last battle ended, their names were not written. They became numbers. 3,000 lost, 500 fallen, casualties. The human sound of their existence reduced to arithmetic. But the earth keeps better records than men do. Beneath the surface, bones rest like quiet letters, spelling stories that no one reads. Rain falls on the same ground where they once stood, where they fell, where they vanished. Flowers grow over their resting places without knowing the weight they cover. Each spring, the soil rises and breathes again, carrying fragments of their lives into the wind. Somewhere, the past whispers back, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. No one builds monuments for the ordinary. Yet the ordinary is what keeps the world turning. Every castle, every throne, every line of history rests on the invisible shoulders of those who labored and fell without recognition. Their silence built the stage for every remembered triumph. The songs sung for kings were written with their echoes. The glory of victory was painted with their shadows. In some quiet way, they remain eternal. Not in names or records, but in rhythm, the pulse of generations that follow, unaware yet connected. A soldier forgotten in one century becomes the soil that feeds another's harvest. The breath that left his body becomes part of the air a child will one day inhale. There is a soft, invisible continuity that hums beneath history's noise. It is not fame, but it is belonging. And perhaps that is gentler. Imagine them now, not in pain, not in the chaos of battle, but in stillness. Thousands lying beneath a calm sky, no longer divided by sides or nations. The earth equalizes all, the armor rusts, the bones soften, and the ground folds around them like an embrace. The wind passes over their resting place as it does over seas and mountains, carrying a quiet hymn that has no words, only peace. The truth is, history forgets by design. It cannot hold every name, every face, every heartbeat. It is not cruelty, but capacity. It remembers in outlines, not details. Yet in the quiet between those outlines lives something vast. Every nameless person becomes part of the great continuity, the invisible fabric that connects centuries. They are not erased, they are diffused, like light through mist, touching everything without being seen. To think of them now is not to mourn, but to understand. Their absence teaches the shape of presence. Their silence makes room for the living. They remind us that being remembered is not the same as mattering. The smallest act of endurance, the breath taken in the cold, the step forward through fear, the helping hand offered in the dark, was enough. That was their mark upon the world. And so when the pages of history speak only of kings, perhaps the deeper story hums beneath, the story of the unnamed, the unseen, the forgotten who made survival itself possible. They exist in the calm after the noise, in the pause between victories. They are the breath that continues long after the shouting stops. At night, when the world grows quiet and you listen beyond the surface of things, you can almost hear them, the slow rhythm of their rest, the faint echo of their lives folded into the soil. Not ghosts, but guardians of stillness. The nameless dead are not gone, they are simply at peace, part of the long, patient memory of the earth. And maybe that is enough. To be forgotten by history, but remembered by the ground. To vanish from words, yet remain in wind and rain. To have lived once, to have breathed once, to have belonged once, and to rest now not in triumph, but in tranquility. The story of the nameless is the story of all who came before, all who built without credit, all who walked quietly through time. The next time you walk across an old field or stand in a place where battles were fought, remember the silence beneath your feet. It is not empty. It is filled with the quiet strength of those who made the world and asked for nothing in return. Their legacy is not carved in stone, but written in the calm pulse of life itself. The hum of rain, the warmth of sunlight, the steady turning of the seasons. History may not say their names, but the earth does. Every breeze carries a whisper, every river remembers, and every dawn begins with their peace. The medieval peasant garden. The garden, the heart of life. In a world of iron, war, and endless uncertainty, the garden was peace. It was small, sometimes no larger than a few steps across, but within its soil lay everything that kept life steady. A handful of earth, a few green shoots, the quiet rhythm of growth. While the world beyond the fence roared with battles and hunger, here the air moved softly. Birds sang, bees drifted lazily through sunlight. The farmer's hands, rough and tired, became gentle again as they touched the soil. These were not gardens of luxury or beauty. They were built from necessity and patience. A patch of onions, beans, garlic, leeks and cabbage was enough to feed a family through the seasons. Each seed was a promise, each leaf a small victory. The people who tended them did not think of wealth. They thought of survival. The garden asked for effort, but it gave back something greater than food. It offered rhythm, meaning, and calm. The mother who worked the soil knew it like the lines of her own hands. She knew which corner caught the first light of morning, where dew lingered longest, where the moon's pull made seeds swell with life. The garden spoke to her in subtle ways, through scent and silence, through the slow turning of color. It was her map of the universe, measured not in miles but in seasons. When the harvest came, it wasn't celebration that filled the air, but gratitude. Carrots pulled from the ground, onions hung in bundles, beans dried in the attic rafters. These simple acts were prayers without words. The earth had given again, and for another winter the family would endure. Beyond its function, the garden was a refuge. It healed the mind while feeding the body. Here, a farmer could forget the taxes, the wars, the noise of authority. Here, the soul remembered gentleness. The scent of mint, the quiet hum of insects, the warmth of sun on the back. These were reminders that life, even in hardship, could still be kind. History often remembers kings and battles, but it was the gardens that kept the world alive. They were the quiet hearts beating beneath every village, every century. Within their fences of dry branches and hope, humanity learned to survive, and, just as quietly, to find peace. Women, keepers of knowledge. In the quiet rhythm of the medieval village, women were the memory of the land. They were the ones who knew the secrets of soil, the moods of weather, and the soft language of plants. While wars raged and kings changed, their wisdom endured, passed from mother to daughter through hands, not words. There were no books in these gardens, no parchment, no ink. Only the whisper of experience, stored in breath and gesture, carried gently across generations. They knew which earth needed ashes to breathe again, which herbs drank moonlight best, and which roots should never be touched by sunlight. Their knowledge was practical, born not of study, but of survival. To them, the world was a living system, every leaf a sign, every scent a message, and they could tell when rain would come by the taste of the wind. They could mend a fever with the same calm patience they used to bake bread. They understood that care was a kind of science, quiet and precise. In small, fenced gardens, women became guardians of balance. They planted with intuition sharpened by centuries, garlic to keep sickness away, sage for cleansing, mint for spirit. They harvested not for luxury, but for life itself. In every seed they placed, there was trust in the earth, in time, in themselves. When the world beyond their fences grew harsh and uncertain, the garden remained their refuge, a small piece of order in a universe of change. Children learned by watching. A mother's hand pointing to a leaf was worth more than any sermon. She taught which plants could soothe a cough, which could feed a family, and which could kill. The lessons were simple but sacred. To know the land was to live, to respect it was to endure. History rarely speaks their names, yet their wisdom shaped civilization. They were healers, cooks, farmers, and quiet philosophers of the natural world. Their gardens were laboratories without walls, their memories a living library. Through famine, plague, and war, they kept humanity's gentlest knowledge alive, the art of nurturing, the patience of growth, and the faith that life, if tended with care, will always return. Companion, planting, the instinct of nature. In the quiet rhythm of medieval life, every garden was a living conversation between plants and people. The farmers of that age did not study ecology or chemistry, yet they understood balance with a kind of calm intuition. They knew that nothing in nature grew alone. Every plant had a partner, every root a quiet friend beneath the soil. The garden was not a collection of crops, but a network of relationships, subtle and alive. Onions stood beside carrots, their scent keeping insects away. Beans reached upward, drawing strength from the sun while returning nitrogen to the ground below. Marigolds glowed at the edges of the beds, bright little suns that soothed harsh light and kept pests at bay. Garlic, cabbage, leeks, and herbs grew side by side, each lending something invisible to the other. The medieval gardener did not command nature, they collaborated with it. The result was not perfection, but harmony, a small patch of land breathing with quiet intelligence. Each season, the garden shifted. Crops changed places, roots explored new soil, and the earth renewed itself. The people did this not because they had read of rotation or sustainability, but because they had watched and learned. They listened to what the land whispered through success and failure. When one corner of the garden grew tired, they let it rest. When the rain came too early, they remembered to plant higher. Nature was not their servant, it was their teacher. There was no rush, no obsession with yield or profit. The rhythm was slow, patient, circular. They measured time not in hours but in seasons, not in profit but in survival. Their understanding of growth came from observation, not theory. A wilted leaf meant too much shade, a yellowing sprout meant the soil needed rest. What they practiced was science without numbers, a knowledge built from rhythm, repetition, and faith. It was the wisdom of coexistence, passed through hands rather than book. The garden thrived because people listened, and the people endured because the garden forgave. Across centuries, that gentle dialogue between soil and soul remains a quiet testament that nature, when treated as a teacher, always finds a way to keep us alive. Fertilizer, the brown gold of life. In the simple rhythm of medieval living, nothing was wasted. What others called dirt, the farmer called treasure. What nobles dismissed as filth, the peasant saw as promise. To them, manure was not shame, it was the smell of survival, the quiet pulse of renewal. Horse dung, kitchen ash, straw, and scraps from the table, all of it gathered into piles behind the house, where time and patience turned decay into life. It was not glamorous, but it was sacred. Every few weeks the farmer would turn the heap with a wooden fork, watching steam rise from its heart. Beneath the rough surface, the warmth was alive. Bacteria, unseen and tireless, worked in silence, transforming the discarded into the fertile. What the earth had given returned to it again. This was not waste, but memory. The garden remembering itself through the rhythm of rot. When spring came, the brown gold was carried to the fields, a handful here, a scatter there. The soil grew darker, richer, breathing easier. The farmer's hands, stained and cracked, glowed with a kind of quiet pride. He did not think of science, of chemistry, of carbon and nitrogen. He thought only of life feeding life. The process was slow, patient, inevitable. The earth took what was humble and turned it into beauty. In those days, there were no words like recycling or sustainability. There was only necessity, and necessity became wisdom. What could not be eaten was given back to the land. What could not be used was transformed by time. The cycle was complete, elegant in its simplicity. It was, in truth, the earliest system of renewal humanity ever created, a harmony between need and nature. Nothing was thrown away because nothing was truly separate. The field, the kitchen, the animals, and the people were all part of one long breath, shared with the earth. And perhaps that is why their world endured, not because they conquered it, but because they listened to it. The brown gold beneath their feet was more than fertilizer. It was gratitude made visible, a quiet lesson from nature that nothing ever dies, it only changes shape. and begins again. Moon calendar. The rhythm of the sky. Before clocks ticked or calendars ruled the seasons, people looked upward. The moon was their compass, soft and reliable, glowing with quiet instruction. Each phase offered a message, each shape a reminder of time's gentle pulse. When the crescent first appeared, thin as a breath, it was a sign to plant seeds that needed courage to rise. The waning moon, when its light retreated, was for roots, plants that reached downward, drawing strength from the dark. And when the full moon arrived, round and bright, it was time to harvest, to rest, and to let the world breathe. The medieval farmer lived by this rhythm. The moon was not a mystery, but a neighbor. Its light spilled softly across the fields at night, guiding tired hands and quiet minds. On nights of silver brightness, they worked without fear, pulling weeds, checking the health of crops, whispering to the soil. The sky above was a living calendar, more precise than any parchment or clock tower could ever be. They didn't speak of astronomy or science, they simply observed. The stars changed their places, the air shifted its tone, and frogs began to sing before the rains came. The people listened. They did not rule the land, they moved in time with it. Every phase of the moon shaped their actions, the sowing, the tending, the waiting, the harvest. To live in this way was to belong entirely to the world, to trust the slow rhythm of light and shadow. The moon gave more than time, it gave peace. It reminded them that every cycle returns, that no season lasts forever. Even in hunger or cold, they knew that the moon would come again, faithful and calm. The garden followed her lead, breathing with the same grace. Plants rose and rested, roots reached and released, and life continued, steady, patient, and eternal. Long before written calendars, humanity learned the simplest truth from the sky, that the world keeps its own time, that light always returns, and that balance lives in the space between growing and resting. The moon was not a clock. It was a comfort, a soft, silent guardian reminding the earth how to breathe. Herbal remedies, the field's gentle pharmacy. In the soft heart of every medieval garden, there was always a corner of healing. It was small and unassuming, just a patch of green near the fence, where the air smelled of mint, thyme, and chamomile. Here, leaves held memory, and roots carried comfort. The people of the time did not have clinics or prescriptions. They had their gardens, their patience, and the slow wisdom of plants. Chamomile for the stomach, thyme to cleanse the air, wormwood to drive insects away and soothe pain, garlic to guard against infection. Each leaf had a purpose, each stem a quiet strength. When someone fell ill, they did not rush or panic. They walked to the garden, gathered what they needed, and trusted the rhythm of the earth. The remedies were gentle, born from observation and care. Boiled, dried, crushed, or soaked in oil, they carried both medicine and memory. The women of the household were often the healers, their knowledge passed through stories and gestures. They knew how to dry leaves under shade, how to mix herbs with honey, how to turn what grew freely into protection. Their shelves were lined with jars, filled not with pills, but with colors, deep green, soft gold, earthy brown. The scent of herbs drifted through the house, calming the mind even before the tea was poured. To drink chamomile at dusk was to end the day in peace. Its sweetness eased the body, its warmth loosened thought. In hard times, when food was scarce and worry constant, that simple cup was enough. It was comfort, safety, and a kind of faith that nature, even in its silence, still cared. The medieval garden was more than food and survival, it was sanctuary. Within its leaves lay resilience, in its scent, relief. Each plant was both healer and friend, a reminder that wellness was not bought, but tended. And though centuries have passed, the lesson remains that healing often lives quietly, close to the soil, waiting to be found in the simplest of things, a leaf, a root, a breath of earth after rain. The four seasons, the circle of life. In the quiet rhythm of the medieval countryside, time did not move in straight lines, it turned in circles. The people did not count days or dream of vacations. They lived within the steady heartbeat of the seasons, guided by soil, rain, and light. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter were not names on a calendar, but voices in the air, each one calling softly, each one reminding them that life itself was a cycle of giving and returning. In spring, the world awakened, the frost melted from the ground, and the earth exhaled the scent of new beginnings. Hands sank into cool soil to plant the first seeds. There was tiredness in the body, but hope in the heart. The garden hummed quietly with promise. Every seed dropped into the furrow carried faith, the unspoken belief that warmth would come, that green would return. The first sprout pushing through the thawed ground was proof enough that winter had not won. Summer arrived like a deep breath. The days stretched long and bright, filled with the soft buzz of insects and the whisper of wind through grain. The people worked from dawn to dusk, pulling weeds, watering, repairing fences. It was labor without hurry, each task part of the same living rhythm. In the heat, sweat became a prayer, the body and the land moving together. Nights were for rest, for cool air, and simple meals under the fading sky. Autumn carried the scent of fulfillment. Fields turned gold, baskets overflowed, and laughter returned to tired faces. It was the season of gratitude, not extravagance. Families gathered around the hearth to store grain, hang herbs, and share what the earth had offered. The days shortened, the air grew sharp, and every sunset felt like a gentle closing of the year's eyes. Then winter arrived, silent and patient. Work slowed and the land slept. Inside, people mended baskets, sharpened tools, and told stories by firelight. It was a time for reflection, for stillness, for remembering that rest was also part of living. And when the snow began to melt again and the first green shoots appeared through the pale soil, they smiled quietly. The circle had held, the earth, faithful and forgiving, had turned once more, and life, tired but enduring, had begun again. Elage bonds. The garden of sharing. In every medieval village, life was woven from exchange. No one grew everything, no one stood alone. The soil gave differently to each hand, and so people learned to share what they had. Seeds passed from one cottage to the next, small gifts wrapped in cloth, traded with quiet smiles. The onion grower swapped with the bean planter, the herb keeper shared time for barley, and knowledge moved with the same rhythm as wind across the fields. It was not commerce, it was trust made visible. A good seed was a treasure, a living story. When a new variety survived a harsh winter, it became the pride of the whole village. People spoke of it with care, tracing its journey from one garden to another. Each handful of grain, each bean, carried the memory of hands that had touched it before. The act of planting was never solitary, it was a continuation of something larger, a thread connecting generations. Their world had no word for community sustainability, but they lived it. Cooperation was not an idea, it was the ground beneath their feet. When one family's crop failed, others shared what they could. When tools broke, neighbors repaired them together. Even during scarcity, there was kindness. A loaf of bread was split without question, a handful of seeds given freely. Survival depended on generosity, but so did peace. The gardens, scattered across the countryside, were like pages of the same living book. Each told a part of the human story, the patience to wait, the courage to share, the faith that the earth would answer again. Through these exchanges, the people built more than food, they built belonging. In the calm of dusk, when the fields turned gold and smoke rose from quiet kitchens, the villagers rested knowing their work was shared. What one planted, another would tend. What one harvested, another would taste. The soil bound them together, not by law or wealth, but by the simple rhythm of giving and receiving. And in that circle of exchange, humanity found its truest abundance, not in possession, but in connection. The Green Legacy, Lessons from the Quiet Earth. The medieval farmer never spoke of sustainability or regeneration. They had no manifestos, no polished words for what they did. They simply lived close enough to the soil to understand its moods. Theirs was a world without pesticides or chemicals, guided not by science, but by rhythm, of rain, of growth, of decay. What the modern world calls organic, they called survival. The green they tended was not a movement, it was life itself. Each morning began in observation. The farmer looked at the color of the leaves, the dampness of the air, the feel of the soil between their fingers. These small signs spoke louder than any theory. When insects came, they did not spray. They adjusted, moved crops, planted herbs that repelled gently instead of destroying. When the earth seemed tired, they let it rest, rotating fields and planting cover crops to heal it. They knew that taking too much was a kind of theft, and that the land always remembered what it gave. Every corner of their life connected to this balance. Kitchen scraps returned to compost heaps, straw and ash became fertilizer. Water was caught, reused, shared. Chickens scratched through gardens not as decoration, but as partners, eating pests, softening soil. There was no waste, because waste was simply another beginning. Nothing left their world, it only changed form. Their patience was the truest skill. They knew the earth did not hurry and that real growth moved in silence. Seeds took time, seasons took trust. They worked with nature, not against it, and in return, nature sustained them through centuries of hardship. What they built was not innovation, but harmony, the quiet understanding that survival depended on respect. Now the modern world speaks of green living, of rediscovering balance. But for those who once lived by the soil, the idea would have sounded familiar. They would have smiled gently at our rediscovery of what they never forgot. To them, living green was not a choice or a philosophy. It was the only way to stay alive, to belong, to breathe in rhythm with the earth. Their legacy is not in monuments or texts, but in the living soil that still remembers their touch. Spartacus, the gladiator who terrified Rome. The slave from Thrace, the quiet spark of defiance. The story does not begin in the roar of the arena, but in the cold hills of Thrace, where the air was sharp and the ground hard beneath bare feet. There, a man was captured in war, bound, traded, and carried south into the vast machinery of empire. His name was Spartacus. In Rome's endless hunger for power, he was just one among thousands, a nameless figure lost in the shadows of conquest. Yet within him lived something that refused to bow, a quiet ember, that chains could not smother. Brought to the gladiator school in Capua, he was taught the art of killing. Iron met flesh, dust met sweat, and the world became a ring of cruelty disguised as entertainment. Around him, other men, captives, criminals, the forgotten, learned to fight for survival. Their pain turned into spectacle. The crowd above cheered not for life, but for death. Yet even as he trained, Spartacus watched, learned, and waited. Each movement, each command, each rule of the arena revealed not only how to fight, but how to understand power. The Romans wanted obedience. What they created instead was awareness. To Spartacus, every strike was a lesson, every drop of blood a reminder. Freedom, once lost, became a sacred idea, glowing more fiercely the further it receded. He began to see that his body might be enslaved, but his mind remained his own. The rhythm of battle, the discipline of training, all became instruments of something larger than survival. In silence, he was preparing for something that even he could not yet name. History often remembers him as a rebel, a warrior, a symbol. But before the rebellion, he was simply a man observing the nature of captivity. He saw how easily people grew used to their chains, how comfort could disguise itself as peace. And in that realization, the ember within him grew brighter. When he finally rose, it was not anger that guided him, but clarity, the understanding that no empire, no whip, no wall could hold the human will forever. The story of Spartacus is not about war or blood. It is about the quiet decision to stand, to breathe as oneself, even for a moment. And in that moment, history changed. The escape and the first uprising. The night freedom began. It began quietly on a night when the guards were drunk and careless. The moon hung low over Capua, pale against the walls of the gladiator school. Inside, Spartacus and about 70 fellow fighters whispered their plan, their breath shallow with both fear and determination. They had no swords, no shields, only kitchen knives, roasting spits, and desperation. But desperation, when shared, becomes courage. When the moment came, they struck fast, killing the guards, breaking through the gates, and vanishing into the darkness beyond. They ran toward Mount Vesuvius, that sleeping giant whose rocky slopes became their fortress. There, the mountain's cliffs guarded them better than any wall. The Roman cavalry could not reach them easily. The steep paths were narrow and cruel. The fugitives rested under the trees, breathing air that finally felt their own. What had begun as an act of survival became something greater, an awakening. More came to join them, escaped slaves, shepherds, farmers, the dispossessed. Men and women who had nothing left but a longing for freedom. They came barefoot, hungry and afraid, but they came. From dozens they became hundreds, then thousands. What Rome mocked as a band of savages began to take the shape of an army. And at its center, calm and deliberate, was Spartacus. He did not rule by fear, but by reason. He listened, he taught, he turned chaos into structure. His army was not built on cruelty, but on hope. When the first Roman forces came up the mountain, confident and sneering, Spartacus watched them closely. He knew they underestimated him, and that was his strength. He ordered ropes woven from vines, lowered his men down unseen, and struck from behind. It was not brute force that won that battle, but intelligence born of necessity. When morning came, the slopes of Vesuvius were silent, except for the rustle of wind through ash. The bodies of Roman soldiers lay scattered along the rocks, a grim message carried by gravity itself. Spartacus sent them back to Rome, not in words, but in silence. The rebellion had begun, not with vengeance, but with the quiet, undeniable truth that even the most broken people can rise when they have nothing left to lose but their chains. The humiliation of Rome. When fear touched the empire. For a time, the world turned upside down. The mighty empire that had enslaved nations found itself trembling before a man who once fought for amusement. Spartacus, the slave from Thrace, led not soldiers of rank, but people of hunger, shepherds, farmers, fugitives, and broken men, and together they defied Rome itself. What began as a desperate escape became a movement so vast that even the Senate could not ignore it. Their victories came like quiet storms, unexpected and humbling. The empire that had conquered the known world now faced an army that owned nothing but courage. The first Roman commanders sent against Spartacus laughed as they marched. They called his followers a mob, untrained and wild. But when they reached the battlefield, laughter turned to disbelief. The so-called slaves fought not for gold or glory, but for breath, for the simple right to exist as free beings beneath the open sky. They moved with purpose, led by a man who understood not just combat, but the hearts of those who had endured too much. Spartacus used strategy, terrain, and patience. He turned weakness into advantage. One by one, Roman legions fell. Reports sent back to Rome began to change in tone. What once dripped with arrogance now trembled with unease. Commanders spoke of impossible discipline among the rebels, of ambushes that came from nowhere, of soldiers vanishing in the mist. The Senate, accustomed to certainty, began to panic. A gladiator, armed once with kitchen knives, was now reshaping the legend of Roman invincibility. The great generals, men of pedigree and pride, felt shame for the first time, defeated not by kings or foreign armies, but by those they had chained. The humiliation was not in loss alone, but in revelation. That power built on cruelty is fragile. Every triumph Spartacus earned was more than a victory of swords. It was a quiet tearing of illusion. And so the empire that ruled from marble halls looked inward and saw its fear reflected. Spartacus had shown them that strength was not born of wealth or lineage, but of spirit, and that even the smallest spark, if denied too long, could burn through the mightiest walls of the world. The journey north. The hope of freedom. Spartacus never dreamed of thrones or crowns. His rebellion was not about ruling but returning, back to the mountains of Thrace, to the cold wind of home, beyond the reach of Rome's shadow. His only wish was to lead his people north, across the Alps, to a place where chains had no meaning. The road was long, winding through valleys and villages, each step marked by both hunger and hope. Yet for a time, freedom felt close enough to touch. As they marched, the army grew. They liberated farms, broke open prisons, and shared food with the poor. Villagers watched in awe as the once enslaved fed others instead of conquering them. For a moment, the world turned gentle. The people began to believe that perhaps freedom could be real, not as a word, but as a way of life. But freedom, Spartacus learned, is not the same for everyone. Among his ranks were men hardened by violence, desperate souls who saw power where he saw peace. Some wanted to plunder, to live richly before death came. Others wished only to keep running, to escape before the Roman legions returned. Spartacus tried to hold them together with fairness, with reason, but an army of tens of thousands cannot share one dream for long. The unity that began with survival began to fray under victory. Still he walked among them at night, calm and quiet, speaking not of conquest, but of home. He reminded them that freedom was not a prize to win, but a way to live, with dignity, with compassion, with restraint. Yet as the fires burned across the plains, he could sense the turning of the tide. The rebellion that had once felt pure was changing, pulled by ambition, by fear, by the endless restlessness of men unchained, but still not free. And so they kept moving north, chasing the faint promise of safety across mountains that glimmered in the distance, so near, and yet, like peace itself, always just beyond reach.
The tragic turn, the return south.
They were so close. The mountains of the north rose faintly on the horizon, blue, distant, and full of promise. Beyond them lay safety, a world untouched by Roman power. For weeks, Spartacus and his followers had dreamed of that line across the sky, the border between slavery and freedom. Yet, when the moment came, when only a few days' march remained, Spartacus stopped. The army halted with him, standing in silence among the cold fields. No one knew exactly why. Some said he was betrayed, that scouts sent ahead never returned. Others whispered that his people were too exhausted, too scattered, too burdened by the wounded to go on. And some believed something deeper, that Spartacus could not leave, that the same spirit which had driven him to rise could not bear to simply run. Perhaps he understood that freedom gained in flight would always remain fragile. Perhaps he knew that to truly defy Rome, he would have to face it. Whatever the reason, he turned back. The decision spread through the camp like wind, soft at first, then unstoppable. The men who had walked for months toward home now retraced their steps southward, toward danger. There was no celebration, no speeches, only the quiet acceptance of fate. They gathered their weapons, lifted the wounded, and began the long descent back into the lands they had escaped. For the first time, the dream of escape dimmed. The soldiers sensed the change, though none dared to speak it aloud. The Alps, once a symbol of salvation, disappeared behind them, swallowed by distance and regret. Ahead waited the legions of Rome, stronger, more disciplined, and countless. Still, Spartacus walked at the front, steady as ever, his expression unreadable. To those who followed, he remained a figure of calm resolve, a man choosing to meet destiny rather than run from it. The decision sealed their fate, yet it also gave their struggle meaning. For in turning back, Spartacus proved that freedom was not a destination, but a defiance, a final act of courage carved quietly against the weight of empire. Crassus and the Wall of Blood. The last enclosure. Rome, humiliated and restless, turned to one man, Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the wealthiest man in the Republic, a figure both admired and feared. To him, war was not glory but calculation, a business with profit and loss. Where others saw rebellion, Crassus saw investment. The Senate, desperate after years of failure, gave him full command, and with that the quiet cruelty of order returned to the battlefield. Crassus ruled not by inspiration, but by fear. His soldiers were strong, but their discipline had frayed after too many humiliations. So he revived an ancient punishment, decimation. When a cohort fled in battle, 10 men were chosen at random. 1 was killed by the other 9. No one forgot. The message was simple: die by courage or die by cowardice. The Roman army marched again, cold and obedient. Against them, Spartacus's people were weary. Hunger gnawed at their resolve, winter bit through their tents, and freedom began to feel like a distant dream. Crassus, patient and methodical, built his strategy not with speed but with stone. He ordered trenches dug and walls raised, dozens of kilometers of earth and timber stretching across southern Italy. It was a prison built in silence, an empire's net tightening around its prey. Inside the enclosure, food ran out, The rebels burned carts, boiled leather, and huddled for warmth. What had once been an army was now a circle of souls waiting for dawn. Yet even then Spartacus did not surrender. He walked among his people, his voice calm, his eyes steady. The fire that had begun years ago in chains still burned, though the wind of Rome now surrounded it. Outside the walls, Crassus waited. He did not gloat. He simply observed as one might watch the slow turning of fate. He knew that victory was near, not through brilliance, but through endurance. The night before the final battle, the camp was silent except for the whisper of distant waves. Both armies, in their own ways, were trapped, one by fear, the other by hope. And somewhere between them, history itself held its breath, waiting for morning. The final battle. The man who would not kneel. The morning came grey and cold, heavy with the scent of iron and smoke. Around the camp of Spartacus, the last fires burned low, their light fading against the shadow of the Roman lines. The walls Crassus had built were broken in places, torn apart by desperate hands during the night. There was no escape left, only a choice of how to meet the end. Spartacus rose before dawn, quiet and composed. He strapped on his worn armor, lifted his sword, and looked at the faces of the people who had followed him through hunger, fear, and hope. He did not speak of victory, only of dignity. When the walls finally fell, he charged forward first. There was no hesitation. The men behind him followed not out of command, but devotion. To them, he was more than a leader. He was the embodiment of the word they had chased for years: freedom. Spartacus knew he would die, but he refused to die on his knees. The sword in his hand was not just a blade, it was a declaration, a message carved into history, that freedom does not belong to wealth or power, but to all who dare to stand. The battle was chaos, dust, screams, sunlight flashing on steel. Spartacus fought his way through the front ranks, cutting down officers, their crests scattering like leaves in the wind. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide could turn. But the legions were endless, and the circle tightened. Still, he did not yield. No one knows how it ended. Some said they saw him fall, buried beneath shields and blood. Others swore he disappeared into the mist, carried away by fate itself. His body was never found, but in the silence that followed, every soldier, Roman or slave, knew what he had done. He had met the greatest empire in the world and stood unbroken. Spartacus's rebellion ended that day, but his defiance endured. In a world built on hierarchy and obedience, he showed that courage needs no title, that dignity survives even in defeat, and that true freedom begins the moment a man chooses not to kneel. The legacy of the man who frightened Rome, the seed of defiance. When the rebellion was crushed, Rome sought not justice but spectacle. Along the long straight road of the Appian Way, 6,000 crosses rose against the horizon. Upon each hung a body, silent, still, a warning carved in flesh. Crassus ordered it so, turning the road to Rome into a corridor of punishment, a grim parade of what happened to those who defied empire. Travelers passed between the wooden stakes, hearing the creak of ropes, the moan of wind, the soft cry of carrion birds. The message was clear: rebellion ends in ruin. But Rome, in its pride, misunderstood. What died on that road were bodies, not belief. The idea Spartacus carried, that even the lowliest can say no to power, was not bound to bone or blood. It lived in silence, spreading quietly, like a root beneath the surface. The empire could crucify men, but not courage. They could fill the air with fear, but not erase the whisper of freedom that had already begun to echo through time. In the years that followed, his name faded from official scrolls. Historians wrote cautiously, senators pretended to forget. Yet among the poor, the slaves, the weary soldiers of other wars, the name Spartacus lingered like a rumor of hope. He had fought, not for conquest or crown, but for the simplest truth that every human life has worth beyond obedience. Centuries passed, and Rome itself turned to dust. But the story endured, retold in marketplaces, in books, in the quiet imaginings of those who refused to bow. To some he was a hero, to others a myth. But to history he became something gentler and deeper, a reminder that resistance can be beautiful, that dignity can outlast defeat. Spartacus died without a grave, without monument or stone. Yet his legacy was written in something far stronger than marble, in the blood of those who feared him, and in the hearts of those who still dream of standing unchained beneath an open sky. The Greek Symposium. The room where wisdom drinks the calm of thought. There was no clash of swords here, no roar of crowds, only the hush of conversation and the soft flicker of oil lamps. The andron, the men's room of a Greek home, was small and simple, yet it held the vastness of the human mind. Cushions lined the floor, painted walls shimmered faintly in the lamplight, and the scent of pine resin mingled with the sweetness of wine. Outside, the city of Athens rested beneath the moon. Inside, words flowed like quiet rivers. The men reclined on low couches, each holding a cup of diluted wine, never in haste. The host poured carefully, for to drink here was not to escape, but to reflect. Conversation was the true feast. They spoke of courage, beauty, virtue, and love, not as poets or priests, but as seekers of balance. The laughter was low, the tone measured. It was not debate for victory, but for understanding. Each idea hung in the air like incense, rising and fading, replaced by another. In this small space the world slowed. The philosophers did not build empires, but they built something greater, language for the soul. Every question was a key, unlocking the unseen doors of being. They wondered whether goodness was born or learned, whether truth could live without pain, whether happiness was something found or created. There was no rush for answers. The beauty lay in the stillness between thoughts, in the gentle pauses that let meaning breathe. Outside, the wind drifted through the olive trees, carrying faint music from the agora. Inside, the minds of men moved quietly toward clarity. Time seemed to stop, not because it was conquered, but because it was understood. In this room, philosophy was not an argument, it was a form of peace. Centuries later, their names would echo across history, Plato, Socrates, Xenophon, but here, in this soft-lit chamber, they were simply voices in harmony, learning to think, to listen, to be. And perhaps that is the true miracle of the andron, that wisdom was not shouted from thrones but whispered between friends under the calm and infinite patience of the night. Wine as ritual. The taste of reflection. In the stillness of the symposium, wine was not indulgence, it was balance. The Greeks never drank it pure. To them, unwatered wine was chaos in a cup, a threat to reason. The drink was poured into a broad mixing bowl called a crater, where water and wine met in careful harmony. The symposiarch, the master of the feast, decided the ratio: too strong invited madness, too weak dulled conversation. When mixed just right, it opened the mind without unseating the soul. Cups were passed in rhythm, slow and deliberate. No one drank to escape. They drank to listen to others and to themselves. The conversation flowed like the diluted wine, gentle and continuous. The warmth that spread through the body was not intoxication, but understanding. Around them, the lamp flames flickered softly, reflections dancing across faces deep in thought. There were no shouts, no toasts of conquest, only the low hum of calm exchange, the kind that makes the world feel momentarily whole. To drink was to participate in something sacred. Each sip was an acknowledgement of measure, of proportion, of life's delicate balance between passion and clarity. The Greeks believed that wine carried both Dionysus and Apollo within it, madness and reason intertwined. The art of drinking was to let them coexist without either taking control. Outside, the stars hung above Athens in quiet perfection. Inside, time slowed. Ideas drifted like incense through the room, soft, fragrant, lingering. A philosopher might lean back, eyes half closed, tracing the edges of thought. Another would smile faintly, turning a question over like a smooth stone. It was not about finding truth, but touching it lightly, feeling its warmth before it faded again. The symposium was never about forgetting. It was about remembering how fragile reason is, how tender joy can be, and how peace, like wine, is sweetest when shared in moderation. In every careful pour, in every quiet laugh, they practiced the oldest philosophy of all, that wisdom is not a pursuit of answers, but a rhythm, a harmony between the heart, the mind, and the gentle weight of time. Music, light, and the women who sang, the breath between notes. The symposium was never silent. It moved in a rhythm soft as candlelight, carried by the music of flutes and lyres, and by the voices of the hetairai, women of learning and grace who sang not just with melody but with meaning. They were artists, companions, philosophers in their own right. They knew poetry, could recite Homer, could speak of love and beauty without blushing. Their laughter was quiet, their eyes alive with wit. They understood when to sing, when to fall silent, when a single glance could say more than a speech. The air shimmered with sound and smoke. Strings hummed, the flute sighed, and the low hum of conversation intertwined with the notes like a breeze through leaves. Light flickered against the painted walls, glinting off wine cups and faces lost in thought. Nothing was hurried. Each sound arrived gently, lingered, and drifted away. Between two notes came stillness, a pause that held more power than the music itself. In that stillness, people felt their hearts slow, their minds open. The hetairai sang of gods and men, of longing and loss, of the strange beauty of fleeting things. Their songs were not loud or proud, they were tender, made for listening more than hearing. As they played, they reminded the room that art was not an escape from life, but a mirror of it. The philosophers stopped arguing. The wine poured slower, even the lamps seemed to sway to the rhythm. In the golden half-light, everything seemed suspended, the sound, the thought, the very breath of the room. Music became meditation, the voice of the soul made gentle. And when the final note faded, no one clapped or spoke. They simply sat in the quiet afterglow, aware of the rare peace that lingers when words and sound have said just enough. It was in these moments, between noise and silence, reason and desire, that the Greeks found a kind of truth, that beauty does not demand attention, it only asks to be felt. The conversation of philosophers and poets, the art of gentle thinking. As the evening deepened and the wine softened the edges of thought, the room grew quiet, almost sacred. Words began to move slowly, not as weapons but as waves, steady, measured, reflective. The symposium was never a contest. It was an unfolding, a quiet dance of minds searching not for victory, but for clarity. Around the circle, men leaned back against cushions, their faces calm, their voices low. The topics drifted like constellations: love, justice, the soul, beauty. No one sought to conquer the conversation. They sought only to touch the truth lightly, the way one might touch the surface of still water. Socrates might sit at the center, his eyes bright with thought. He would ask a question so simple that it sounded almost foolish, then let it hang in the air, untouched. The silence after his words was not empty. It was alive, full of reflection. Others would smile, tilt their heads, and answer not with certainty, but with wonder. A poet might quote Homer softly, another might respond with laughter, another with a line of verse. Ideas became music, each voice a note, each pause a breath of understanding. In this space, thinking was not labor, it was rest. The act of speaking slowly, of choosing each word with care, became a meditation. There was no rush to conclusion, no hunger for applause. The pleasure lay in the unfolding itself, in the shared stillness that thinking together creates. The lamps flickered gently, shadows moving across painted walls. The scent of resin and honeyed wine filled the air. Time lost its shape. Outside, the city slept, but here, inside the andron, the night was awake, softly, thoughtfully. It was in these quiet hours that philosophy and poetry met, not as rivals, but as companions. The philosophers learned rhythm from the poets, and the poets found reason in the philosophers' calm. Together they created something rare, a conversation that felt like breathing, a wisdom that asked for nothing but presence. The game of wine and wit when thought learns to play. As the night deepened and the air grew warm with laughter, the Greeks turned conversation into play. Cups were lighter now, voices softer, and the room glowed with the golden calm of half-drunken wisdom. Someone called for kotobos, a game both simple and strange. Each guest would take what little wine remained in his cup, flick it through the air, and aim for a small bronze plate across the room. If the drop struck true, it rang with a clear silvery ting, like the laughter of Dionysus himself, drifting through the lamp-lit air. The sound was music to the moment. Whoever hit the mark was toasted with gentle applause, a sign that fortune, or perhaps the gods, favored them that night. Those who missed were not mocked, only teased. Their task was to offer a poem as penance, a few lines made on the spot, inspired by wine, chance, and good company. Sometimes the verses were awkward and clumsy, other times unexpectedly beautiful, rising from the air like sudden sparks of genius. In these moments, no one was competing. There was no score to keep, no pride to defend. The purpose was joy, the pure, unguarded kind that appears only when minds are free and hearts unburdened. Laughter moved easily between them, light and unforced. Even the failures became part of the beauty. The flick of a wrist, the ring of bronze, the murmur of poetry. It was all a kind of rhythm, the rhythm of being alive and thinking together. In that dim, fragrant room, the line between intellect and play disappeared. The Greeks understood something simple yet profound, that the mind, like the body, needs to dance sometimes. And under the watchful eyes of Dionysus, wisdom smiled, loosened its sandals, and joined the game. Eros, the dissection of love. In the soft candlelight of the symposium, love was not a confession, it was a subject of study. The Greeks did not rush to speak of hearts or passion, they spoke instead of Eros, the divine force that moved all things toward beauty and truth. To them, love was not emotion, but elevation, a slow ascent from the flesh to the soul. Plato called it a ladder, each rung lifting the mind from desire to wisdom, from seeing beauty in one face to recognizing it everywhere. The room was warm with wine and thought. Cups glimmered in the lamplight, and words drifted gently across the air. Someone spoke of how eros begins with the body but ends in the spirit, how longing itself can become sacred when it reaches beyond possession. Another compared love to fire, painful yet pure, something that burns not to destroy but to illuminate. No one blushed. No one whispered. They spoke of love as calmly as of mathematics or justice. The conversation was not about pleasure but perception, about what it means to see clearly through the eyes of longing. To love, they said, is to recognize the divine in the imperfect, to see order in chaos, to find the eternal hiding in the momentary. The wine loosened their words but not their minds. Concepts softened, shimmering in the flickering light like reflections on water. They spoke in metaphors, in images, in gentle paradoxes. Love, they agreed, was not madness but memory, the soul's remembrance of beauty it once knew. Outside, the night of Athens was silent, but inside the andron, eros hovered like a quiet flame. It warmed without burning, guided without forcing. And when the last cup was emptied, no one felt drunk, only peaceful, each person carrying within them a small, shining understanding that love, at its truest, is the mind's way of learning how to see the world with tenderness. Politics in laughter. The whisper beneath the wine. In the soft hum of the symposium, conversation often drifted toward dangerous shores. Between sips of wine and gentle laughter, power was discussed, not through decrees or speeches, but through stories, jokes, and riddles. The guests were not just thinkers, they were statesmen, generals, poets, men who shaped Athens with words rather than swords. Yet here, within the quiet glow of oil lamps, their debates took on the form of play. They spoke of war, but as metaphor, of democracy, but through parables. Laws became riddles, and generals became characters in amusing tales. The laughter that followed was never loud, but layered, half humor, half warning. Everyone understood, yet no one said too much. To speak plainly about politics was to tempt danger. To speak beautifully was to be free. So they spoke beautifully. The wine helped. Its softened edges turned sharp opinions into philosophy. Even criticism became artful. A jest about a tyrant might sound like praise. A verse about virtue might hide a plea for reform. This was the Athenian way, truth disguised in laughter, rebellion cloaked in rhythm. Words became shields and irony, a quiet act of courage. The symposiarch would smile, pretending not to notice the double meanings swimming through the air. Outside, the city slept under its democracy. Inside, its very soul was being rewritten, one clever phrase at a time. The laughter that filled the room was gentle but knowing, the laughter of people who understood that wit could travel where law could not. Politics in that room was not power seized, it was power shared, diffused, made human again. In the sound of soft amusement and the clinking of cups, Athens learned something timeless. That truth, when spoken with grace, can survive even under the weight of empire. When reason grows drunk, the truth beneath the wine. As the night deepened, moderation began to slip away like sand through fingers. The cups were filled more quickly, the laughter grew louder, and the careful rhythm of the symposium dissolved into something looser, freer, more human. Words that once floated like poetry now stumbled into shouts. Someone gestured too widely, spilling wine across the floor. Someone else laughed so hard he forgot the point of his argument. The air was warm with chaos and joy, the kind that only comes when logic loosens its grip. Philosophers who once spoke like priests now argued like sailors, their voices rising, falling, overlapping. A fragment of Plato here, a jest from Aristophanes there. Someone quoted a line of Homer and forgot how it ended. The symposiarch, the host, watched it unfold with quiet amusement. This too was part of the ritual. Even wisdom, they believed, needed to be shaken sometimes to prove it was alive. There were nights when the symposium ended in revelation, and others when it ended in snoring. But both belonged to the same pursuit, the search for truth wherever it might be hiding. As Plato once wrote, when wine surpasses reason, philosophy becomes laughter. And in that laughter there was something genuine, something untouched by pride or performance. For beneath the wine and argument, a deeper honesty stirred, masks fell away, men spoke from instinct rather than intellect, from longing rather than pride. The philosopher, the poet, the politician, all became simply human again. When the lamps burned low and the room fell quiet, the last sound was often a soft sigh, half contentment, half surrender. In the blur between clarity and sleep, they discovered a truth the sober often forget. That even in disorder there can be grace, and even in drunkenness, a glimpse of the soul. The legacy of the symposium, where thought was born. Morning came softly to the quiet room. The air was cool again, the frenzy of the night dissolved into calm. Servants moved gently through the andron, clearing the remnants of brilliance and chaos. The overturned cups, the stains of wine, the ashes from extinguished lamps. What remained was silence, scented faintly with grapes, smoke, and wax. The guests were gone, but their words lingered in the still air like echoes that refused to fade. No one would have guessed that the greatest ideas of Western thought began here, between laughter and intoxication. The symposium, though wrapped in ritual and wine, was never truly about indulgence. It was about exploration, the act of thinking aloud in the company of equals, love, virtue, justice, truth. These were not studied in temples or courts, but born at these tables beneath the shimmer of lamplight and the rhythm of conversation. From those nights came Plato, who saw beauty not as flesh but as form. From them came Aristotle, who measured the world with reason, yet still honored wonder. The foundation of philosophy was not forged in war or law, but in the calm after laughter, in the silence that follows deep thought. The symposium was not a party, it was a bridge between pleasure and wisdom. Between the sip of wine and the pause before an answer, something timeless awakened, the courage to question, to doubt, to imagine. The Greeks understood that truth did not live in temples or scrolls, but in dialogue, in the living spark that passes between minds when they meet honestly. Not every night produced a philosopher, but every philosopher in some way was born from such a night, a moment of warmth, of shared thought, of freedom gently discovered in the company of others. The night slows, a gentle farewell. And now the lamps grow dim, and the voices of history fade into quiet. The philosophers have left their tables, the gardens sleep beneath the stars, and the echoes of the forge, the field, and the feast all soften into silence. You have walked through centuries tonight, through the dust of battle and the calm of thought, through hands that built and minds that dreamed. The world, once loud with struggle, now exhales. Everything that needed to be said has been spoken. Everything that needed to be felt has settled like snow on still water. Outside, the air is cool and forgiving. The moon drifts slowly above old cities and forgotten roads. Somewhere, a river keeps its patient rhythm, the same rhythm that carried the ancient ones through their days. You can let it carry you now. Breathe. Let the noise of the present fall away. There is no past to chase, no future to hold, only this quiet space between them. The same peace that once filled the symposium, that rested in the fields of Greece and the villages of Rome, now rests here with you. The mind loosens its grip. Thoughts wander like dust in a shaft of fading light. You've listened, reflected, and traveled far without leaving your place. Now it's time to rest, to let the centuries close their eyes with you. History for tonight can sleep. The world hums softly in the distance, steady and kind. Your breath slows to meet its rhythm. Every story you've heard tonight, the warriors, the gardeners, the dreamers, all return to stillness. So let go and drift. The night is calm and the world is safe. Sleep deeply, traveler. You have come far enough.